Hello everybody, and welcome to Drydock episode 124. This week's questions are taken from Guide 188 on the all-big gun designs that preceded HMS Dreadnought and the Battle of Jutland Part 1 video. Dr. Gull 1888 asks, could you shed some light on the Italian Co-belligerent Navy, their ships and operations? I was surprised that, although being in Alexandria, the Littorios were excluded from the Italian Co-belligerent Navy. Why was that? So with the Italian armistice in 1943, there was quite a bit of discussion as to what was going to happen to the Italian Navy for the duration of the conflict. A lot of it was going to be allocated as war prizes once World War II was done, but for the minute, there was a lot of questions. Well, are we going to store them? Are some of them going to come over to our side, kind of like a Free French style situation, or what? And you've got to remember that there were now multiple competing interests for saying that they were in charge of the Italian government. Obviously, you had the Germans backing up a regime that, shockingly enough, wanted to continue its alliance with Germany and fight with them. But outside of that, it wasn't just a case of, well, pro-German and anti-German. Within the more anti-German side of things, you had factions that wanted to restore the Italian monarchy, factions that wanted to go full-on Republican, as in not having a monarch, and various people sort of halfway between, and there was also a certain number of Italian communists. Eventually, it may come as a surprise to no one that the British were rather in favour of bringing back the Italian monarchy, and the Americans were more in favour of the party that wanted to make Italy a full republic. They settled on a compromise candidate, and that was loosely recognised as the, well, at least as far as the Allies were concerned, legitimate government of Italy for the duration of the war. Now, under those auspices, a number of Italian ships then formed the Italian Co-belligerent Navy, which then supported Allied operations in the Mediterranean and the Atlantic until the end of the war, when obviously it could go back to being the Italian Navy. But when it came to the battleships, the Allies had some problems. The older battleships weren't really of that much use by late 43, early 44, so they weren't too fussed about the Co-belligerent Navy having those back to use as basically training ships. But they were a bit more worried about the Littorios, because the Littorios had a number of technologies and various maintenance requirements that really required the trained Italian cruiser. A battleship is not something you can easily hand over to a completely different nation and just say, okay, fine, operate that. So they'd have to be operated by pretty much by the crews that were on them, maybe with a little bit of transfer from some of the other ships. However, the Allies had some doubts over the exact loyalties of some of the members of the battleship's crew, and whilst any warship going rogue and turning on the Allies would be bad, the sheer number of warships that the Allies could bring to bear by 43-44 in the Mediterranean and Atlantic theatres was such that any rogue destroyer or cruiser could be fairly quickly and easily dealt with. But if you had a rogue Littorio-class battleship wandering around, especially if it was in close formation with Allied units when it started shooting, it could do a lot of damage before somebody managed to put enough firepower into it to make it disappear. And whilst the risk of such a outright defection was considered relatively low, it's kind of a risk-reward situation. The dangers of that occurring were quite considerable compared to the overall reward of, well, yes, we have another battleship, but with the Italian Navy out of the war, and pretty much the only serious capital ship threat this side of the Pacific being Tirpitz and Scharnhorst, and there were more than enough Allied battleships to deal with them, and the Littorios weren't really well suited for Arctic operations. There wasn't a particularly great need for them. So without a pressing requirement for the Littorios to be brought back into service, and with some question over the crew and the potentially disastrous consequences of the admittedly low chance of them going rogue, it was decided that it would actually just be safer, cheaper, and easier to just store them. First, obviously, at Malta, where they sailed to at the time of the armistice, then in Alexandria, and then later on they shuffled them down to a lake in Egypt, where they would wait out the war and their eventual fates. Oliver Mack asks, Admiral Fisher versus Admiral King. Who was better at getting his way? Overall, I'd say Admiral King wins that prize quite handily. They were both incredibly strong-willed, but Admiral King tended to win more arguments and more successfully impose orders on his subordinates than Admiral Fisher did. Now, granted, that could have some rather adverse effects on American interests, with things like the submarine war in the Atlantic when King was involved. But apart from those occasional oversteps, by and large, King tended to get his way. Fisher, on the other hand, whilst he did get his way in certain aspects, such as the creation of battlecruisers, HMS Dreadnought, etc., in other aspects he was shut down on a fairly regular basis. When he was First Sea Lord, of course, the first time he was First Sea Lord, he tried to push through what would effectively be the Lion class instead of the Indefatigable class, and the fact the Indefatigables exist rather illustrates he lost that argument. He was pressing for very high-speed battle cruisers, and when he couldn't get that, he was pressing for something along the lines of a Queen Elizabeth class that could get up to its design speed as a unified single-purpose design for the Royal Navy, and obviously that argument didn't go down particularly well either. Later on, he was pushing for the Baltic amphibious attack instead of Gallipoli, and whilst he did get Courageous, Furious and Glorious built, he obviously didn't get Incomparable built, nor did the Royal Navy go charging off down the Baltic to try and conduct an amphibious landing on the northeast German coast. So, yeah, whereas some of Admiral King's demands - ideas, such as refusing to learn pretty much anything from British anti-submarine warfare experience, went through and ended up costing people, Fisher's somewhat more grandiose and wild ideas tended to get shut down a little bit more. So, to be perfectly honest, in most cases, that was probably for the best. I think if he'd won his argument on the Indefatigable class, that definitely would have been of great benefit to the Royal Navy. But outside of that, I'd say most of Fisher's ideas that were shut down probably deserved to be shut down. Although I kind of want to imagine what would have happened if he'd managed to persuade people to start on Incomparable, because Incomparable would not have been ready in any way, shape or form by the time of the Washington Naval Treaty, but probably would have then ended up being converted into an absolutely gargantuan carrier, which would be quite amusing. Whiskey Stell asks, what were the differences, advantages, disadvantages, etc., of the amount of propellers and rudders present on a battleship? Could a battleship steer itself with its propellers? So there's quite a lot of different factors involved, and there's no way you can cover them all in a single Drydock question. In fact, I doubt I'd be able to comprehensively cover all of them, even in a Wednesday video, but nonetheless, we shall endeavour. So, differences in the numbers of propellers and rudders. Generally speaking, with rudders, you're talking about the difference between 1 and 2, although certain exemptions to that did exist. With propellers, you, at least in the time of the Dreadnought era, are talking about 2, 3 or 4. Back in the Ironclad and pre-Dreadnought era, you could find battleships with a single screw, but that's not really a thing by the 20th century. With rudders, the choice of one massive rudder over 2 or occasionally more smaller rudders largely comes down to a question of redundancy versus weight, because obviously if you're going to have multiple rudders, you need multiple sets of rudder machinery, you need multiple rudders themselves. They're not exactly the world's lightest objects, And of course, there's more penetrations of the hull, which could go badly wrong if it got breached, so there's a lot of build-up there, and even more weight. The flip side, of course, being that if you have one rudder and that rudder gets disabled, you are pretty much up the creek without a paddle as far as controlling your ship goes. But on the flip side, if you have multiple rudders, then any individual rudder doesn't have quite the same authority over your ship as a single rudder might do. And depending on how you link the machinery, you might end up, if one of them jams, both of them might jam anyway, which doesn't help. The other thing is multiple rudders do lend themselves a little bit better to being positioned in an optimal place with regards to the stream of water that's being chucked out by your propellers, so there's always that, which is fun. And depending on the amount of power your ship is chucking out, there might also be a question of whether or not you can actually turn the ship with its sheer mass and the amount of power that would be going past it on a single rudder. Because obviously if you've got a very, very large ship, something like an Aya or a Yamato, then your propellers are going to be chucking out a lot of power, there's going to be a lot of inertia in your ship, and you may or may not have the motors to be able to turn a single massive rudder against that particular kind of force. Now, with Yamato, they actually did go pretty much for a single massive rudder with a somewhat questionable secondary backup slotted in, but that was a much, much smaller, and as the term suggests, backup rudder. It wasn't designed to primarily control the ship. Whereas on the Iowas, you have two slightly smaller rudders positioned directly behind the two innermost props, and that is pretty much an optimal position when it comes to deflecting the water in order to obviously turn the ship. Now, as for the propellers, again, you've got a similar trade-off. More propellers, more complex, because you're going to have more machinery, more penetrations of the hull, etc., etc., more sort of redundant weight, but you can also get more power down on more numerous propellers, because if you are putting a serious amount of power through, say, two propellers, you're either going to have to make those propellers incredibly large, and they're pretty substantial already, in order to avoid just uselessly spinning through a cloud of cavitation bubbles, and also hoping that your propeller shafts can actually hold against the strain. Whereas if you have more numerous propellers, you can afford to put the same amount of power through more numerous smaller screws, and therefore you can actually get up to higher speeds because you're not going to shear the back end of your ship off. The other advantage of having more than two screws is that your center shaft, in the case of a 3-shaft design, or center 2 in the case of a 4-shaft design, quite often can be set before the advent of really well-made and complex geared turbines, can be set to using cruising turbines or diesel engines or some other form of slightly lower output, more efficient power use, which allows you to motor on quite happily at your cruising speed without having to engage the outer propellers at all. And then you can, especially in the earlier days of things, have those outer shafts dedicated purely to turbines that are set up for extremely high speed running, as far as that goes, whatever particular speed is determined to be high speed in a given era. And so that allows you to operate your ship in a manner that means you don't run out of fuel quite as quickly as you might do otherwise. And of course, the more propellers you have, the more redundancy you have, although the flip side is that you have more risks because there are more propeller shafts to bend or break or to let water in. One of the disadvantages of the 3-shaft design is that it's actually very difficult to steer your ship if you happen to lose your rudder. And this goes into the can of battleship steer itself with its propellers. Technically, yes. And in fact, a number of ships would do so. But you have to play around with the power settings. It's not quite just a case of increase power to one side a little bit. And whilst that will give you a very, very slight turning motion, with something the sheer scale of a battleship and with its inertia, you're not really going to notice all that much of a difference. Whereas if you, say, put your two port side propellers on reverse and your 2 starboard propellers on full forward, you will get a fairly noticeable turning movement. Obviously, if your rudders are jammed a la Bismarck, this is not going to have quite as much of an effect, and on Bismarck itself being a 3-shaft design, when you've only got 1 propeller on each side doing that, the amount of force that's exerted is, again, considerably less. The other problem is, of course, that if you're not aiming to make a full-on, sort of quite severe turn, if you've got a 4-shaft design, if you say run 1 outboard propeller backwards, 1 outboard propeller at full speed, and you keep the other 2 going at a lower rate, you actually will also get a certain amount of forward motion. So if your rudders are jammed, you can do that to keep a straight course and actually move forward at some velocity, whereas with the 3-shaft design, that's a lot more difficult. So in summary, if you want to go at high speed, you need as many propeller shafts as you can. 4 is a good number, and if you can, you probably want dual rudders rather than a single one, but size, weight and speed constraints on your ship might lead you to take some other choice. For example, the Nelson class were 2-shaft designs because, well, they're only going to go 23 knots ostensibly, so they didn't think they needed the additional hassle of 2 extra shafts. Steve Valley asks, some articles about the Washington Treaty don't have it quite right, as they say carriers in existence or building at the time of the treaty don't count toward the treaty limit. Chapter 1, Article 8 of the treaty says carriers in service or building as of November the 12th of 1921 are experimental and not subject to the replacement schedule laid out in Chapter 2, but it does not say anything about their tonnage not counting. The US Navy converted Langley to a seaplane tender to free up the tonnage for Wasp, and with Ark Royal, the Royal Navy was at its 135,000-ton limit. The Illustrious class was ordered in early 1937 after the Japanese withdrawal from the treaty became effective at the end of 1936. It occurs to me that the RN had the option in the early 30s of reducing Argus, Eagle and Hermes to seaplane tenders, as Langley was, freeing up enough tonnage to build 2 more Ark Royals. Did the Royal Navy give that option consideration? So, yes, it technically would have been possible to ditch Argus, Eagle and Hermes to get a couple more Ark Royals. The problem was that the 1930s was very much a game of 2 halves for the Royal Navy. In the earlier part of the 30s, when Ark Royal was being ordered, Royal Navy budgets were quite tight. So asking for the money to build 2 more Ark Royals, bearing in mind they were the largest carriers by, well, Ark Royal was the largest carrier by a significant margin that the Royal Navy had built up to that point, would probably not have flown very well with Parliament. Yes, of course, you're getting rid of the operational costs of keeping Argus, Eagle and Hermes running, either by scrapping them or taking them down to seaplane tenders, but if you scrap them, you're not going to get an awful lot of money back from them, certainly not enough to pay for 2 Ark Royals, and by reducing them to seaplane tenders, you are addressing the treaty issue, but you're now putting the entire cost of building and running 2 more Ark Royals on top of the cost of building, well, not building, but running and converting Argus, Eagle and Hermes, which is just going to be a non-starter with the early 30s Royal Navy budget. By the time you get to the latter part of the 1930s and everyone is starting to build more aircraft carriers, well, everyone at that point is thinking that in the event of a war breaking out relatively soon, it's better to have sort of second-line carriers, if you like, that can do something than it is to get rid of them and therefore have nothing. And the Royal Navy at the time also, especially in the interwar period, needs a lot of hulls. It's similar for similar reasons to the fact it needs a lot of cruisers. It has a lot of different commitments. So if you, in the early 30s, even assuming money was no object, reduce all 3 Argus, Eagle and Hermes to seaplane tenders, and you get 2 more Ark Royals, great. Well, you now have 3 fleet carriers instead of 1 fleet carrier and 3 smaller carriers, but that means that you've got probably 1 less station that you can cover, which is something of a problem. Now, granted, you could argue that maybe continuing to use them as seaplane carriers somewhere like off the China station, you can use seaplanes to do the job of what was formerly an aircraft carrier, but it's not an optimal solution. Lazy Tick asks, could Scheer have hooked around Beatty during the run to the south by leaving the old pre-dreadnought battleships behind as a stopping point for the battlecruisers, and then having Beatty surrounded with the scouting group to the east, the modern battleships to the north, and the pre-dreadnoughts to the south? In my understanding, this was absolutely the Germans' goal, would have prevented the chase to the north, and therefore probably Jutland as we know it. Sadly, I don't have the ranges on hand to calculate if this would be possible or not, but I don't know how far away Scheer would have had to go to prevent him being spotted during the hooking. The problem really with this is speed. Scheer was coming up relatively quickly, albeit at a combined pace, but then once he had a good idea that the enemy were well, not quite in sight, but close, he did actually rack his ships up to full speed, to the point that by the time they eventually encounter the British fleet, they are actually already a bit strung out with the pre-dreadnoughts falling behind. So having to divert significantly further to the east to avoid being spotted at all, that would take even longer, and even if he'd spent a couple more hours at full speed, well, that only adds a few more miles to where he'd be able to get to. And hooking all the way back round, even more time, and at that point he would be spotted coming in, and he's still at a speed disadvantage versus the British. So whilst the British wouldn't have necessarily been able to flee north, they would have probably been able to bend a course northwest and still evade. The amount of time that Scheer would require to get his entire dreadnought battle line completely across the north would be such, if he's doing it undetected, that by the time it's in place, the British will be far enough south that, again, they could evade by heading in a slightly not quite directly north direction. This is the problem with trying to cut off a fast unit in open seas. You might have had better luck trying to cut off some of the Queen Elizabeths, but this is the other problem, is the Queen Elizabeths themselves. Whilst Beatty definitely didn't have the best of the run to the south up against Hipper, once the Queen Elizabeth got involved, it became a very, very different ball game, and the odds were then stacked against Hipper. His ships were taking damage. The fact that they managed to then obviously join up with the High Seas Fleet, which forced Beatty's forces and Edmund Thomas's 5th Battle Squadron to turn back, was fairly fortunate for them, all things considered. And to be perfectly honest, if Hipper's forces keep running south, so the engagement goes on for considerably longer whilst Scheer is conducting this manoeuvre, and presumably Hipper is trying to draw the British ships further and further south so they miss Scheer's manoeuvre, then first scouting group is going to have even longer under unsupported fire from 5th Battle Squadron, which is not going to do anything good for them. And then what is left intact of first scouting group and Beatty ships are going to run headlong into 6 pre-dreadnoughts. And yes, 6 pre-dreadnoughts plus first scouting group would be a very definite problem for Beatty's ships. But with the Queen Elizabeth piling in close behind, if somehow Scheer then manages to cut in across the top and they find themselves boxed in on 3 sides, Beatty's most sensible option at that point would have just been to use the Queen Elizabeth to blow straight through the 6 pre-dreadnoughts, which they would have been very capable of doing. They would basically be the weak link at that point, because first scouting group A, as I said, would be fairly battered from a prolonged engagement with 5th Battle Squadron, and they've still got to hold the east, otherwise the British can just go that way. And yeah, I really don't fancy the chances of 6 pre-dreadnoughts having to fight a very angry and somewhat desperate 5th Battle Squadron. Josh Thomas Moore asks, what is your opinion on the battlecruiser? On one hand, we have the Battle of the Falklands, which shows the ship's strengths, and then we have Jutland and Denmark Strait showing their weaknesses, It seems like they're good in anything that doesn't involve other capital ships. Personally, I'm conflicted and would like to hear your views. So I would put a slight qualifier on that, in that Denmark Strait is not actually really anything to do with proof of the strength or weakness of a battlecruiser concept, but you'll be finding more about that in videos coming up later this month, so I won't say much more on that. But outside of that, Jutland, again, you've got issues with ammunition storage and handling, so whilst the loss of Invincible and Indefatigables probably, they showcase other weaknesses, which I'll come to in a minute, the fact that Queen Mary explodes is not a mark against the battlecruiser design, it's a mark against the tactics and strategy being employed by Beatty. But with that aside, I would divide battlecruisers up roughly into two. So you've got the early concept battlecruisers, which the Invincibles, and by dint of them being built, the Indefatigables, they have a mission role which you then kind of see re-emerge in the late 1930s, early 1940s in things like the Alaskas. They are cruiser killers. They're designed to hunt down and kill ships that are smaller than them, have less firepower than them, and have equal or less armour than them. And in that role, that concept of the battlecruiser works very well. Where that concept of the battlecruiser doesn't work very well is when anything starts shooting back with anything approximating a similar sized armament. So in a lot of ways, the concept in and of itself is sound, but in a overall reality that is reflective of there being more than one dominant naval power, the concept can be seen as flawed, because by building it, you are going to prompt the other side, whoever that is, to build their own versions, at which point you don't have the ability to resist that ship's firepower, and they're a bit too big and expensive for you to build en masse, so you can't rely on mass numbers. In this case of the Royal Navy, in the run-up to World War One, again, they make a lot of sense for what the Royal Navy wants to do in terms of wiping the seas of enemy commerce raiders early on, and the Falkland Islands, as you mentioned, is a good example. But in their design role, they're kind of a one-shot weapon. They accomplish that goal, then what do they do? There is no other mission profile as they're initially conceived. Cruisers are part of the fleet screen, so I guess you put them in the fleet screen, but when you put them in the fleet screen, that means they're going to come up against the enemy fleet screen, and if the enemy fleet screen has, or the enemy fleet has seen you building these things, they're going to be building their own versions, and you end up with a kind of a Jutland scenario, at least as far as the eyes are concerned. You then have the sort of the secondary type of battle cruiser. So this is exemplified by most of the German battle cruisers, and by sort of Lion, Princess Royal, Queen Mary, Tiger, and not quite Hood, because Hood was redesigned into what's effectively the first fast battleship. So Hood is kind of often doing its own special thing. But with regards to those sort of Derflinger, Seydlitz, Moltke, and the British ones I just mentioned, they are still technically designed with that early mission of cruiser killing, but they're now also designed to be theoretically able to face off against each other. And the strengths and weaknesses of the two sides' weapons and armour loadout on overall theoretically balance each other out when you don't have odd things like stacking cordite everywhere, but in actual fact, when you look at the lessons learned coming back from Jutland, the Germans actually acknowledge that whilst they like their thicker armour, they reckon the British approach is probably actually slightly better, again outside of the random explosions part, because they've got the British with their bigger guns are able to negate, even with the slightly dodgy shells, a significant chunk of the Germans' armour advantage. And the Germans being forced to take lighter guns because they're dedicating more percentage of their ship to protection, end up looking at it and going, well, yeah, but then the British didn't need as thick armour to resist our fire. And you look at the damage that something like Tiger takes, it's pretty much fine afterwards. I mean, obviously it's got full of shot holes, but it's not in danger of sinking or anything like that. Tiger, the next day, Tiger could go again in another battle. Most of the German battle cruisers couldn't. So that there is this kind of swing back and forth. The only real commonality in that type of battle cruiser is that they're faster than battleships. Whether they have lighter armament, heavier armour, or heavier armament and lighter armour depends on the national flavour. But those kinds of ships in the World War I context and in the probably 1920s context, they are actually quite useful. The overall thought behind them, now that they're accounting for almost any kind of engagement they might face, it is pretty sound. The kind of end of the battle cruiser as a specific type, if you like, was simply the fact that by the time you got to the very late part of World War I and you got Hood's revised design, the slightly more revised design of what would have been the other three admirals, and indeed what some of the ships that the Germans were looking at producing post-war, this is where you start to see the melding of the concept of battlecruiser and battleship into the fast battleship, which kind of extends into two lines of thought. Post-war, you have the G3s, which are very definitely fast battleships, and which kind of they come from the trend of taking the battle cruisers and up-armouring them, whereas in the Japanese building plans you have the battlecruiser and the battleship merging mainly by ramping the speed up on battleships and thinning their armour down. If you look at their 1920s build plan as the two forms kind of merged, the only ones in the 1920s of the major navies who were still distinctly building big, heavy, slow battleship and sort of very fast, heavily armed, very lightly armoured battlecruiser was the US Navy. Kevin Kennelly notes, starting with a quote from the Jutland video, 2 decades earlier the German Navy had scarcely been more than a glorified coastal defence force. Now it stood as the second most powerful navy on the planet. He then asks, how did that happen? Yes, Germany had steel and coal industries, but what about shipyards? How did they build that fleet? Are shipyards and shipbuilding skills that easy to develop? I'm aware of the US Navy's explosive growth in World War II. How did the Germans do it? It was a mixture of things that actually went back a lot further than you'd think. Now, Germany, we've got to remember, is actually a fairly young state, only formed in the latter part of the 19th century. But the various German states, I guess you'd call them, that existed before, actually had quite a strong naval tradition, at least on the northern end of things, that went back all the way into the medieval period. The Hanseatic League, for example, was quite heavily dominated by what we today would see as German ports, although there were a few others involved as well. So there was a certain tradition of shipbuilding on the North German coast and the facilities that came with that. You then had the rise of Prussia in the middle of the 19th century. I mean, they'd kind of begun to really throw their weight around a bit earlier than that, but from a naval side of things, the mid-19th century, and they actually, when Prussia was still its own thing, founded 3 very large shipyards, so Kiel, Danzig, and Wilhelmshaven. Wilhelmshaven being the largest, but also the last one. The other 2 were actually founded round about commensurate with the outbreak of the ironclad era. So they had quite a lot of plans for major ship construction. Then, of course, that went over to the North German Confederation, which then went over to the German Empire. And so the German Empire inherited these big shipyards, which were already to varying degrees in the process of expanding, as Germany was somewhat later in the game to undergo the sort of full industrial revolution, but that did have its benefits when it came to the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And so you ended up with this situation of, yes, a fairly young country, and the individual navies not being particularly large, but between the naval traditions, shipbuilding traditions, I should say, of the various northern German states, and this naval ambition that Prussia had kicked off when Prussia was still Prussia, they were actually relatively well placed to go into a fairly considerable naval expansion. They had shipyards that were capable of suddenly building a surprising number of ships, and with the will put behind it by the various Kaisers, they were able to expand on what the Prussians had done to a point that then they actually had shipyards capable of churning out a fairly respectably sized navy. They were also, to be perfectly honest, helped by the fact that most of the people who could compete with them weren't, by the very late 19th, early 20th century, in much of a position to do so. The French, as we've covered in other videos, were a little bit all over the place. They were a bit late into the battleship game because of their flirtations with the Drachinifel, and the various issues with their shipyards meant their building processes were very slow and somewhat scattered, even though they theoretically had the industry and the finances to match or overmatch Germany. The Russians, again, theoretically had the shipyards, but yeah, late era Imperial Russia had all sorts of problems which massively diminished their effectiveness as far as it came to churning out large numbers of warships, even though they did come up with some fairly nice designs for specific naval systems like the 12-inch gun that the Ganguts used. The Americans, for the most part, had the budgets really, really squeezed by Congress, and the opening of those financial floodgates was somewhat paced. So for a good chunk of the period running up to World War I, there wasn't really that much that the US Navy could do to catch up, because they just physically weren't being given the funding to do so, even though they had more than enough industry to compete with the German naval build-up. At which point the only people who had the money, the will, and the shipyards to compete with and overhaul the Germans were the British, and that's what the British did. The Germans were working pretty much flat out and realised they couldn't actually beat the British in a building race. But yeah, so it was this combination of luck, circumstance, and a certain level of will to actually get these things done. And the fact that by the time the German Navy really kicked off its building efforts in the sort of 1900s, most of the naval infrastructure they would use had been upwards of 40 years in the making. So it wasn't a quick job to get their naval building infrastructure up to the point that they did, but when they had it, they really used it. Peter Patrie, I think, says, you noted the first officer of Warspite had his battle post in B turret. Was it customary to have the second in command in a turret away from the bridge? So in this era, particularly, and obviously aboard things like battleships, there wasn't a specific Navy mandated the first officer or XO must be at this particular battle station. There was a little bit of freedom to choose there, but when you're talking about armoured ships firing large amounts of high explosive at each other, there was a very conscious awareness that a single hit to the bridge or even to the conning tower could kill everyone there. At which point, given that if you did lose the captain or captain and admiral, etc., you would need someone to take over command of the ship. So it would then be a very bad idea to have the first and second ranking officers on the ship in exactly the same location where they could be killed by a single shot. So when action stations sounded, or general quarters, depending on the navy that you're in, the XO and the captain most of the time would be in different locations. It was a good idea to have the XO in a nearby location, but one that would be, shall we say, fairly heavily protected against something that might happen to his superior. So depending on where the captain was, that might involve the captain being in the conning tower and the XO being on the bridge. It might involve the captain being on the bridge and the XO being on the conning tower, or as in the case of Warspite, the XO might go to B turret. or, because again, heavily armoured place, relatively close to the bridge, and various combinations of other relatively well-protected locations. So the general principle just being that if something happens to the captain, hopefully that event won't also take out the XO, and then the XO is hopefully close enough to be able to take command of the ship fairly quickly if something should happen. Russell Timmerman asks, it seems that in World War I and World War II, no one ever struck their colours. It seems like every ship fought to the bitter end or ran away. When did the tradition of honourable surrender stop in naval warfare? There were a fair few people who ran up the white flag in World War I. HMS Pegasus, seen here, being famous for being the last Royal Navy ship to strike its colours. But various other ships, for example, Emden, when it beached, struck its colours to avoid Sydney continuing to fire at it. A couple of other German ships would also end up running up their colours towards the end to stop the gunfire. And this kind of, I mean, it's not gone away, this tradition. The problem really with why you don't see anywhere near as many white flags as you do in earlier naval wars is largely down to two things: increasing range and increasing lethality. Obviously the ship wants to do its level best. The idea of a white flag is that you hoist the white flag if you have no other option, and any further resistance is just going to end up getting your crew killed. There are even some reports at the time, as was covered in the video on Operation Rheinübung, that some men on Bismarck may have attempted to strike their colours and raise a flag, but it was never entirely certain what was going on with that. But with the increasing range and firepower of naval weaponry, it made the old style surrender in that circumstance much, much more difficult, because, well, if you explode like Hood did or any other number of ships, you're not going to be raising a flag at that point for obvious reasons. But even if your ship is battered more conventionally, the range of incoming fire means that it's going to be much more difficult to spot any kind of surrender in good time, and therefore check the fire and accept the surrender. But also the sheer brutal nature of high explosive and armour-piercing shells means that your ship can go from, even assuming it doesn't explode immediately, your ship can go from functional warship with a decent chance of fighting back, or at least somewhat intact, to blazing charnel house where anyone nearby who even could strike the colours or give authorization to do so is dead, or cut off from communication with other people who could. And this is one of the other things, is a subset of that is the sheer size of a warship. Even on a ship of the line, if something was going badly wrong, with a decent enough voice, you could make yourself heard from anywhere along the length of the ship. If, for whatever reason, the senior surviving officer was in the bow, you could, with a good shout, if it wasn't in the middle of a broadside, tell someone at the stern to strike the colours. Whereas on a modern cruiser or battleship, that's not really an option. You'd have to be in relatively close proximity. There's also something of a culture shift going on, which is very well established by World War II, and to a certain extent actually quite well established by World War I. When you look back at the late 18th, early 19th century, the culture of personal honour is somewhat more there when it comes to naval combat, in as much as if a ship is defeated and surrenders, then the officers are treated as having, yes, you've honourably surrendered, we will honour that, yes, we have your ship, but you fought well, and probably get exchanged at some point later on. And as long as a captain could prove that he'd done his utmost and he'd only surrendered to save his crew, or because the situation was otherwise hopeless, it wasn't generally held against him. Whereas by the 20th century, there was much more of a kind of, no, you will not have the ship, whatever, we'll sooner scuttle it than hand it over to the enemy. Admittedly, there's some technological secret types of concerns as well, which do factor into it, but it is a much more of a nationalistic, no, you will never have this mindset, which also makes people likely to fight on a bit longer in a desperate attempt to keep the ship out of the enemy's hands. And if you're going to be completely fair, in those circumstances, because the numbers of ships in a given navy are generally forever reducing downwards compared to their previous size, because ships get larger and more complex and therefore more expensive, it does kind of mean that the loss of any single ship is going to be more keenly felt. I mean, if you look at, say, the Napoleonic Wars, the British could capture a dozen French ships of the line and it would sting, but the French could build plenty more and have them in service for the sort of, with a relatively brief interruption as far as the overall Napoleonic Wars went, and their fleet would be back up. It's like, oh yeah, those ships, well, we used to own them, now they're fighting against us, oh well. And occasionally ships we took almost traded back and forth several times. Whereas, especially say by World War II, if your navy only has a handful of capital ships, then, well, losing one without having done absolutely every single last possible effort is going to be a lot more of a sting. And also, if there is a possibility the enemy might then turn that ship around and use it against you, the balance of power changes an awful lot more than it would if you, say, took a third rate in the late 18th century. Colin Williams asks, you've received multiple questions about modern carriers in World War II, but I don't think you've been asked how many World War II era planes could fit on such a vessel. So, what would an early or late war US Navy air group look like on something like a Ford, both including and excluding on-deck parking? Well, the first thing to point out is that you probably would end up with a hard limit, because one of the things that the US Navy found in both the Essex and Midway classes was that whilst both ships theoretically could operate a much larger air group than they went to sea with, especially the Midways, once you hit over about 100 aircraft, managing the air groups was just utterly impractical. Now, fair enough, those were in the days when they were straight deck carriers, whereas with the angled flight decks and the relative size of World War II aircraft, you might be able to conduct multiple sort of lanes of landing operation at once, but we'll come to that in a minute. Now, a Yorktown class carrier had about 65 to 70,000 square feet of space if you combine the flight deck and the hangar deck, and an air group theoretically of around about 90 if you include aircraft tied to the ceilings, which you could also do in theory on a Ford class. It's certainly got the hangar height for it. So if you divide one by the other, let's take the middle and say 67,500 square feet. That means you've got an aircraft density of approximately one aircraft for every 750 square feet of available hangar and flight deck space. Now, obviously, that's an average. It doesn't count for the fact that obviously aircraft will be more densely packed in rows, and then there'll be big empty spaces where you need to either move aircraft through the hangar deck or where you've got the takeoff and landing areas on a flight deck. It's an average that will serve relatively well. Now, if you look up the cited figures for the hangar and flight deck space on a Ford class are somewhat variable. This is one of the problems with modern ships, but piecing together approximate averages would suggest around about 8 acres combined hangar and flight deck space on a Ford, which when you convert that through to square feet works out at just a fraction under 350,000 square feet, which if you then divide through by the 750 square feet per aircraft density that you find on a Yorktown class, suggests that you could fit something around about 460 US World War II era aircraft on a Ford class, assuming that you packed them in at roughly the same density as you did on a Yorktown. And yeah, that's just a truly ridiculous number of aircraft. Practically speaking, it's probably going to be a lot less than that. For one thing, as I said, you're probably going to want to be having dual takeoffs because it's more than big enough, maybe even 3 or 4 aircraft taking off at once. You're not going to need to use the catapults, but you could have 2 aircraft taking off on the tracks of the bow catapults and probably have 2 aircraft taking off on the forward part of the angled flight deck, and probably do 2 simultaneous recoveries after at once. Maybe more. I'd hazard it more, but you could at least do 2 simultaneous recoveries. And so you're probably going to be devoting a greater proportion of the flight deck space to air operations. But yeah, that's a truly colossally scary number of aircraft that you could get on there. The other aspect of the question, which I didn't read out, was also what kind of aircraft would you then actually use on such a ship that would be too small to operate off of a World War II era carrier. And for that, I'd say, well, look at what the British were doing towards the end, and also the Americans. You had the F-7F, you had the Tiger Cat, you had the Sea Mosquito followed by the Sea Hornet, so twin-engined aircraft. I mean, running the Doolittle raid off of a Ford would be dead easy. You wouldn't need any of the ridiculous lightning measures that they had to do to get them to launch off of Hornet. But yeah, you're never realistically going to be operating 450 plus aircraft off of a single carrier. The flight deck control operations are just far too difficult and complex. So what you would probably see is still have lots of fighters, and the dive bombers would probably stay about the same, but I suspect the torpedo bombers, things like the Avenger, would probably actually be replaced by much larger twin-engined aircraft carrying 2, 3, 4 torpedoes at a time. And that, like a Ford class back in those days, would actually give carriers strategic bombing capability to a certain extent as well. You're not going to get B-29 on there, but certainly medium bombers shouldn't have too much of a problem operating. You just got to invent a folding wing for them. Chris Martin asks, after the Deutschlands, the Kriegsmarine opted for very high-pressure steam plants instead of continuing to develop large diesel engines for these Scharnhorst and Bismarck classes. Was this a mistake, given the problems they had with the steam plant, and would Scharnhorst or Bismarck have been a better raider with a diesel plant, even at the cost of a knot or 2 in top speed, i.e. greater range, needing fewer tankers to support the mission, etc.? The problem with diesels at the time was that they just flat out didn't generate enough power. Bearing in mind, the Deutschland class exceeded their design speed on less power, so they actually did a very good job with a hull form. But the actual initial power estimates for the diesel engines on the Deutschlands were never actually met. And the amount of power that you need to travel in the high 20s of knots is nothing compared to the amount of power you need to travel in the low 30s. The power requirements jump very, very quickly. And so it was very, very clear that the amount of diesel power, or the diesel engines with a power output that was necessary, they just flat out didn't exist, and no one had any idea how long it would take them to develop them. The Germans would have preferred diesel propulsion if they could, especially for the Scharnhorst, but they looked and went, well, we need this speed. The power plant in diesel just doesn't exist, but it does exist with high pressure steam. And although the German high pressure steam plant was very finicky, you could keep it going as long as you had a well-trained enough crew in it, all its various little eccentricities, which obviously the Germans did have. So no, I don't think it was a mistake, because one of the other things that the Germans had to face was that if they sacrificed a knot or 2 in speed, that would start to drop the speed of their ships down to within overload power distance of the treaty battleships. And the French in particular, which obviously were their main design opponents, when they're building the Dunkirks, and then later on, obviously, the Richelieu's coming afterwards, but the Dunkirks especially, were designed to move at higher speed. So if they dropped their own speed, they'd end up in a situation of either not being able to get away from or being overhauled by ships like the Dunkirks, and similarly facing off against British battle cruisers, although especially when the Scharnhorst were being designed, that wasn't necessarily top of their mind, but they still had to think about it. It would mean they wouldn't be able to get away from them, be run down by them, and also cruisers. The Scharnhorst and later Bismarck speed allowed them, if not to entirely escape cruisers, to at least decide whether or not they were going to fight them. Whereas by dropping a knot or two in speed, cruisers could just keep on them no matter what, and obviously in large enough numbers then mob them. So there was a huge tactical disadvantage for the situation the Germans were in dropping a knot or two or three, that would not be made up for the fact that you could simply go a little bit further. So yeah, I think given the circumstances and the technology available, the Germans probably made the right call by sticking with their targeted speed and adopting a plant that could give them that, rather than getting a slightly more efficient diesel plant that would reduce their speed down to the point where they'd be caught and destroyed by superior numbers of enemies. Admiral Tiberius asks, Drach, do you think the SS Richard Montgomery is still dangerous? And what could be the damage if some terrible accident happened and its cargo detonated? So for those of you unaware, the SS Richard Montgomery is, or rather was technically, a Liberty ship that was acting as an ammunition transportation ship and was in the Thames estuary, not a million miles away from where I sit right this instant. And it was anchored. It dragged its anchor, went aground, tide went out, ship broke in half, tried to recover the explosives. Ship continued to break open, so they had to leave them, well, as much as they hadn't recovered, and so it now sits in two sections containing about 1.4 kilotons of TNT. And yeah, that's the actual high explosive, not including the weight of the bombs and such that contain them. It sits in the Thames estuary, and yeah, I do think it is still dangerous. Every risk assessment and evaluation that's been done in the last 20 years has said that whilst the chances of explosion are relatively remote, they all are pretty certain that the explosives themselves are still viable. It's just that what would set them off is, as long as the exclusion zone is respected, somewhat more difficult to point at, but it could still happen. So yeah, I mean, the fact that earlier this year they were looking at trying to cut the masts down because they were placing strain on the hull indicates they still think it's a very dangerous site. As for damage, if it did go off, well, unfortunately, we've all recently seen what that explosion in Beirut did to the city there. And this explosion, if it all did go off, would be maybe 20-25% more powerful, maybe slightly more. Now, fair enough, it's not right up next to a city the way that that particular incident in Beirut was, but there is a fairly large town called Scheer quite close, and yeah, it's also in water as opposed to on land, so there would be quite the shockwave going everywhere. I don't think the shockwave or the resulting water surge would likely be powerful enough to cause any major problems in London, unless it was absolute high tide, in which case, if you had an absolutely unlucky confluence of events and maybe a spring tide, if the Thames barrier is up and then a big surge of shockwave-driven water comes up the Thames, that could be something of a problem. But generally speaking, I don't think London itself is at risk. It's be more the case of what would happen to the poor old people of Sheerness and the surrounding area, because you'd have to deal with a shockwave, which would be bad enough to smash windows, maybe probably damage buildings, and then given the fact that this is a ship and most of this explosive is in bombs, you're going to have an awful lot of very hot, very fast-moving metal coming over as well, and exactly how far that flies is not something I particularly would want to find out. Luckily, I'm fairly well outside the blast radius. And finally for this week, Leon Wu asks, we constantly hear that the Albacore was a replacement for the Swordfish, yet it was terrible. So how did a replacement aircraft get made that was worse than its predecessor, and what exactly was so bad about it? Were any British naval aircraft, aside from the Swordfish and later the Seafire, any good? I think British carrier aircraft do get a little bit of an unfair stick a lot of the time. Now granted, some of them were used in roles which they really shouldn't have been, and some of them were pretty bad, but at the same time, if you compare the Scheer, which is oft derided, compare that to, say, the Val, the Japanese dive bomber of the early war period, they're actually pretty competitive. But there's not an awful lot of performance difference between them. So Val's better in some aspects, Scheer's slightly better in others. The problem the Scheer had was they also tried to use it as a fighter. The Scheer was a perfectly good naval dive bomber for the early war period. It was just a really, really bad fighter. Now, fair enough. The Rock, okay, yeah, you got a point with that one. The Fulmar, as I'm sure Jamie from Armoured Carriers will tell you, and I'll tell you here as well, the Fulmar does often get an awful lot of somewhat undeserved stick. It was actually a fairly successful aircraft when it was doing its job of fleet defence. Yes, okay, it's not going to be able to tangle with single-engine fighters like the Bf-109, but quite frankly, it very rarely, if ever, came across them. Yeah, obviously, for a carrier-based naval fighter to just not really be in the business of tangling with fighters like the 109 is not necessarily a good thing, but it's not as bad as people sometimes like to make out that it was. I mean, yes, certainly you wouldn't want to take a Fulmar up against a Zero, but they generally weren't taken up against Zeros because of the operational circumstances where they were being used. The Firefly is kind of an evolution of the Fulmar. By the point it's actually introduced towards the late war, yeah, it's not competitive really as a fighter, but it, weirdly enough, turns out to be a fairly good strike aircraft. The Barracuda is actually, again, you compare it to something like the Avenger, when no one questions that the Avenger's a good aircraft. It's in the same ballpark as the Avenger. Again, some stats better than others on both sides. The Barracuda notably is somewhat more long range than the Avenger. But yeah, so it's definitely not a bad aircraft there. Quite a lot of the stick you get is because the Royal Navy goes into the war and basically has most of its naval aircraft designs frozen for a good couple of years. So it's fighting in 41, 42 with quite a lot of aircraft that were current or due to be replaced in 39, whereas the Japanese and American air forces, naval air forces, are fighting with aircraft where they've had another 2 years to prepare, and basically an entire generation of aircraft have been taken out of service and replaced. Now, the problem with the Albacore is that although it was on paper designed to be considerably better than the Swordfish, it's supposed to have an enclosed cockpit with heating, which would have come as a great relief to many Swordfish pilots. It was supposed to be faster, it was supposed to be longer range, carry a slightly heavier payload, etc., etc. The biggest problem with the Albacore, though, was that because it tried to put all these extra bits and pieces onto the airframe, like the enclosed cockpit, as well as ramping up its notional capabilities in terms of things like power, it meant that overall, whilst the on-paper capability was theoretically superior to the Swordfish, and in some cases, yeah, it was slightly faster in level flight on a warm summer's day, the overall performance, at least by the accounts of the Fleet Air Arm pilots, was generally held to actually be slightly worse than the Swordfish once you factored in more general conditions, rough weather, that kind of stuff. Basically, the Swordfish was more likely to be operational on any given day, and pilots found it easier to work with than the Albacore. And when the replacement is kind of, well, we've got a few paper stats that suggest it might be slightly better, but in practice the pilots actually prefer the old one. Yeah, it's not a huge step up. Part of the problem is that the Albacore, like the Swordfish, is coming in on the very tail end of the period when the Fleet Air Arm doesn't actually have full control over its own aircraft or design specs. And of course, as I said before, you have the problem of it's delayed coming into service because of the outbreak of World War II. And if it wasn't for World War II, I suspect the Albacore either wouldn't have been deployed at all, maybe would have been deployed in very small numbers before the Barracuda came along, and it was just kind of thrust into a role where it was becoming increasingly obsolete. I mean, the Swordfish was in a lot of ways obsolete by the start of World War II, but it managed to fight through a period when some of those issues weren't necessarily quite as obvious. And the Royal Navy was fairly sensible with how they deployed them, whereas by, say, 42-ish, around about the time of the Channel Dash, when you see the Swordfish get utterly cut apart by the Luftwaffe, that's at the point where anything like a biplane-based torpedo bomber really should be out on escort carriers, helping in the Atlantic or the Arctic, which, aside from the odd radar-equipped Swordfish, is pretty much what they ended up doing for the latter part of the war. Right, and that brings us to the end of this week's Drydock. Thank you very much for listening. Really just one bit of channel admin this week, albeit it is a fairly big bit of channel admin. For those of you panicking from the description, no, I'm not shutting the channel down anytime soon. But as some of you, especially those more long-term listeners, will be aware, since I started this channel, I have had a day job. And that day job was as a highways engineer in first Transport for London and then later the London Borough of Croydon, because I am, of course, based in southwest London. Now, you might have noticed the use of the operative word was there. It's not really much of a secret if any of you could be bothered to read up on these kinds of things in the media, but Croydon Council is a little bit broke. As in, they owe more money than some small country, third world countries' GDPs. And there's a whole story behind that. But whilst technically I'm still wearing the Croydon Council badge on my day-to-day work, I'm not going to talk about that any further, at least here. I may have a lot to say once I'm no longer employed by them, but yes, basically they're broke, they're out of money, they need to make a lot of people redundant, and my position has been deleted, or at least will be deleted, because under UK law, if they're going to make more than a certain number of people redundant, they have to do a consultation. The consultation period in this case runs till the end of January, but let's face it, when was the last time anyone had a consultation done about redundancies where the company turned around and went, oh, you know what, actually, after scaring the living daylights out of you and telling you we were going to get rid of your position, we've actually decided to keep you on. Yeah, I think that the last time that happened, a squadron of pigs flew past the 34th story window that particular announcement was made on. So, long and the short of it, come mid-February, probably, once you take into account notice periods and such, probably won't have a day job. Which, one could say sucks a little bit, but I think in my day-to-day professional field, I've probably got enough name recognition these days that I can transition over to being a consultancy or maybe finding some other line of things. But I can tell you this much, after near enough a year of working from home, I do not want to go back to an office. No, I've spent nearly a decade and a half mostly working out of offices, and now, mostly thanks to the fact that you guys are watching the channel, I don't have to. The amount of revenue from the channel will keep the lights on here at Castle Drach. So, obviously, if I do get a day job, that is kind of more reliable form of income, because as we all know with YouTube and the various changes they make to their ad policies, and the fact that ad income varies dramatically over time and even over months. January historically is obviously usually very bad. Yeah, so who knows what will happen with that. So maybe I'll look at getting a day or two a week job as a consultant or something, just to make sure I'm ticking over enough to keep the lights going. And to be perfectly honest, I would rather prefer that any revenue I get from the channel can be funneled back into the channel, whether that be through purchasing of naval photos to go in the archives online, or preserving bits of history, or paying to go and film at dockyards and museum ships and archive visits and such to produce content for you guys, and obviously to help out those museum ships and such like as well. I'd much prefer the channel's revenue goes into that. So if at all possible, I will find some way to keep the lights ticking over here on my own day-to-day expertise, which will allow the channel revenue to as I say, be re-channeled into the channel, if that makes sense. But if that doesn't work out for any reason, well, there's at least enough coming in from the channel to keep the lights on. So either way, there's a very long way of saying I will have more time to devote to the channel over 2021, by the sounds of it, one way or the other. And I suppose that's, if you're listening to this, and let's face it, if you've reached the end of an hour and a bit Drydock of me talking to you, you hopefully vaguely like the sound of my voice. So I guess that's good news for you guys. And if you don't like the sound of my voice, well, I guess that's bad news for you, because there's going to be more of it. Yeah. Don't panic too much. Whilst, yes, I will be accepting certain sponsorships, as I have been in the past, I will still curate those sponsorships to be appropriate to yourselves. Hopefully most people seem to be happy with the couple of Audible ones I've done, because they seem to be pretty good to deal with, and they have naval history content. So yeah, don't worry, you're not going to have this video sponsored by random thing that has absolutely no relationship at all to naval history. That will not happen. It annoys me enough when other people do it when I'm watching videos on YouTube. I have no intention of doing that myself, and also I'm not sticking any mid-roll ads in ever. In fact, I'll give you this much: if I ever intentionally put a mid-roll ad in any video that I do, whichever one of you happens to be the next person to find or see me can slap me across the face with something very heavy, preferably in a reference book, because I will deserve it. The reason I say intentionally is because obviously you do get sometimes YouTube doing, like they did that stupid thing where they stuck mid-roll ads on everything. That wasn't me. I'd never asked for it. I didn't want them to do that, and I took it off as soon as I found out about it. So you can't hit me for that. But yeah, anyway, I'm probably rambling now. To be honest, I'm kind of looking forward to being able to give the channel even more attention, and plaguing the National Archives with even more requests for visits. Oh, they're going to love me. I think a lot of the staff learned to recognise me by sight back when I worked for Richmond Council, and Q Archives was within my area of work. Now, when I have a sort of semi-professional reason for doing it, I might as well just set up a tent in the lobby. But anyway, enough about me. Thank you very much for listening, if indeed you still are after this little ramble, and I shall see you again in another video at some point. Thank you very much.